welcome everybody to another episode of Spartan Theology. I was about to say Apocalypse here because we were just talking about John's channel, but that's not where we are right now. We're on my channel. So, yeah, we got a pretty exciting interview lined up today. We got Josh and Rachel Rasmussen, who wrote this book, When Heaven Invades Hell. We're going to be having a discussion about the book and just about universalism in general. I think it'll be a really, really cool discussion. I got John on here with me, who is kind of like the one that introduced me to more of this topic, so I thought it'd be really good to have him on to help me do the conversation or do the interview and whatnot. But yeah, so I guess I got Josh's link to his website and the Amazon link to the book. I would definitely recommend anybody check it out. Me and John both really enjoyed reading it. We were just talking about before we went live how we just really enjoyed it. It was like a pretty quick read, but it really brings up like a lot of like interesting. It really made me think about a lot of things in like a different way, which I thought was like really, really awesome. So yeah, if I guess to start off, if you could just kind of introduce yourself, Dr. Rasmussen and Rachel, Josh. But yeah, if you guys could just introduce yourself really quick, and then we'll kind of dive in. We have a list of questions we can go through.
My mission is to uncover insights that really matter. And I guess that's it. That's all you got to know.
And my name is Rachel, and I have a master's degree in physical chemistry, and currently am homeschooling 4 kids. And so Josh and I talk philosophy all the time. So that's sort of the birthing place of this book.
Yeah, everything I know, I've duplicated it into her, and then everything she knows, she's duplicated into me.
Nice.
Right.
Yeah,
Should I introduce myself?
Yeah.
Do you think people know who I am? I've been on this channel so many times that I'm...
Yeah, for sure. But if you don't mind, you can introduce yourself too and tell people, because there probably will be some people who check this out for sure that haven't watched every single one of my other videos. So
yeah. My name's John Depew. I have a little channel on YouTube called Apocalypse Here. Talk about practical theology stuff and how academic biblical studies and theology can sort of inform our everyday life as Christians. I'm a graduate of Duke Divinity School back 4 years ago or so, and I work as a pastor now in Cary, North Carolina, which is just on the road from Durham, where I reside. So it's great to be here, talk with y'all.
For sure. So I guess we're going to start off. We have, in the beginning, we'll talk more about just the book in general. There's definitely some topics that we can go through here. So I think John has the first question we have lined up.
Yeah. Before we kind of get into the book itself, which again, as Ethan indicated, was wonderful. We were kind of wondering about the impetus for this book. Why did y'all choose to kind of step into this? I mean, it's really a contentious conversation among scholars and pastors and lay people. Why did you decide to step into this by writing a work of fiction?
Well, so because it's so contentious, the idea of fiction, this debate that happens in heaven, I feel like that would help people to kind of explore these ideas in a fresh way. They wouldn't feel like we're trying to make some argument that, going across familiar territory, people put up their shields, but instead it would be more of an exploration. And for me, the exploration was the impetus for the book. I mean, Rachel and I, and she can speak to this, have been sort of just on a journey of trying to understand more, and it's not like we've figured out the answers, but we've discovered things that, I didn't know could be discovered. There were things that I had no idea that verse was in there, or that interpretation was in there, or, this analysis was available. And so that's part of what really inspired me after my own thinking had begun to transform. I had begun to make some discoveries. I really wanted to provide a context for people to explore those.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think you're hitting on something when you talk about it's a very hostile debate within Christianity, right? And I think that one thing that I've noticed is that when people are stepping up to the podium as an authority and they are having the purpose of defending a view because this is the right view, then what happens is that inadvertently actually closes down discussion so that you actually are not able to see more than what you already have declared is true. And so when there are different people who say, this is true, no, this is true, no, this is true, no, this is true, then you're actually not having a discussion anymore. And you're not actually open to seeing something differently than you've been taught or than it has been handed down to you. And so one thing that Josh and I like to do just in our own time is we actually like to play acts like different perspectives and different hypothetical, like what if this is the case, what if that is the case, and then we like to just explore the different motivations. Why would somebody think this? Why would somebody argue against this? How does this come across to somebody else? And so because we are constantly doing that in behind closed doors, like that's our main entertainment activity. So, to some people that might seem rather boring, but to us it's very fun. But
well, it's not just endless debates. It's like really trying to explore something. Like we really want to understand, And
it's definitely it's not like for example, David Bentley Hart's book where he is laying out an argument saying this is true, and in fact it's evil if you don't believe this view, or some other books where it's like defending a certain view of the afterlife. This is true, and if you don't believe this, you're going to go to hell, or whatever it is, right? So that's not the approach that we're taking, and in fact we're trying to model through the work of fiction where already you're a little bit detached from reality because it's a fictional world. It's in a sense modeling what it's like to just explore the ideas rather than to just defend an idea. This is what it is, just hands down, and almost like instead of closing it off so that this isn't a discussion, opening it up to say, what can I learn? Is there something new that I haven't seen before?
Yeah, that's super cool. That's like exactly I really like that, because I think I could ask people or give people that you should read this book, check it out, even if they're probably much more hostile to something like David Bentley Hart's book or whatever. Exactly, they're gonna like you said, put their shields up real quick when it's an argument, this is what we think is true. But this can really and it really did for me, got my mind thinking about things in a different way. So I think jumping in with a work of fiction was really, really cool. Definitely.
Well, if I could just add here real quick, I feel like there's kind of layers of goals. And I think for me, one of the big goals was to showcase the difference between the pattern of the kingdom of heaven and the pattern of the kingdom of darkness, to showcase the difference. And that showcasing is completely independent, even of exploring some of these eschatological or sociological ideas about salvation, universalism or annihilationism or whatever those views are. And I think because we talk about, in a sense, we sort of make an argument threaded through the characters. It's possible to almost miss what I think is kind of maybe even a more important take home, which is just identifying the kingdom of heaven versus the kingdom of darkness, which is something that's very applicable to the present. It's not sort of behind the invisible wall of after you die, what will happen. It's here are the earmarks. Here's what the kingdom of heaven looks like. Here's how you can identify it. And in a way, it's almost sort of obvious when you point it out. I mean, the fruits of the spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, sort of obvious. But then showing how this looks in a particular clash of kingdoms through the debate, I think that's where it starts getting interesting.
Yeah, for sure. If I just one thing with that, and another thing, I think we'll touch on this in one of our later questions, but not only does it address universalism, but it also I thought a lot got me thinking about what it actually means to be a person or whatever. What is very who am I? Am I these bad things or what? Because when some people talk about universalism and you get stripped away of all the bad things, are you even yourself anymore, and how those things. So I thought you kind of addressed that too. What that means. But yeah, I think we'll get into a more concrete question around that later. But
yeah. For sure. I was curious about what some of your influences were as far as your tone and sort of style of this book. I was able to sort of detect a bit of C.S. Lewis, not just because he shows up in the book, and also some George MacDonald, really, and in the way that you were sort of articulating things. But yeah, who were some of the influential writers, I guess, that you were sort of thinking of?
Rachel was my she was my influence.
Yeah.
I'm not saying for her to talk, she can talk.
Yeah,
she
okay.
was also
she
my
was
influence.
Your influence. Very
She's
nice.
one of my
Yeah.
influencers.
Good.
Yeah, I think mostly we were just, we were just very authentic. So we were trying to just use whatever form. And I mean, I think somebody on the Amazon review said that, the form of the dialogue is a little bit, weird.
Different.
Yeah, it's a little different. But actually, I felt like I was trying not to, model my writing off of somebody else in terms of like how they would do it. I was actually trying to find a way of delivering the ideas in sort of like the most helpful form for the reader. So like there are certain parts where, for example, the dialogue all gets indented, and it's because it goes into a long monologue, like describing an idea. And, there are other parts where it's not like that because it's just kind of back and forth. It's more like in the scene. And I kind of was making I was kind of the final decision maker in terms of the style of the book. So the way that I was kind of going about that was I really want to make it easy for someone to be able to come back and say, where did the beginning of that thought start? And so you can just kind of go back and say, oh, okay, here's where it started, and here's where it is, here's how it's continuing. And so then it's like easier to keep track of the flow of the ideas. And so because I felt like, it was kind of, the combination of Josh's philosophical inclination. Like we want to just go through and do bullet by bullet, premise by premise arguments, right? And then having that within a creative frame so that it's not just so academic. Like we don't want to end up with like symbols and boxes and arrows that, like we don't want it to be that technical, right? So we wanted to have that combination of the ease of accessibility to the intellectual data that is presented, as well as being put into the artistic frame. So that's kind of how we approached it.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess to kind of start off talking about like the actual book itself, I thought like the idea, the way you addressed it in the beginning with the whole idea of like God asking the people in heaven what they think he should do was just really, really clever, because it could have been like God telling the people like, I'm gonna do this, and this is why or whatever. But like, and that I thought it was just really, really cool because the way they like addressed, we obviously like this sounds good, but there's a reason. Like God, like the whole like debate and everything was just really, really cool. So I was kind of curious like where you came up with the idea to like structure it that way and not like just, it could have been any number of ways, but like, yeah, I thought just kind of how you came up with that idea.
Yeah, so I had this sort of initial outline of the book where the question was going to be posed so that the citizens of heaven could debate the question. And it's interesting because the question was something like, how would you feel if a separated soul were permitted a place with us? Okay. And that very question was interpreted one way earlier in the book by the characters. And then if you noticed, after they had more experiences, they came back to the question again, and they interpreted the question in a different way. It was like we had this line in there, experience unlocks meaning. And this plays a role even like, how do you interpret the biblical texts? Experience unlocks meaning. And so we even played that into the interpretation of the question. So it was there because I feel like people learn through discovery, and the feeling of the whole book from beginning to end is discovery. It's like, what is this? What is this? And so even the question, even the meaning of the questions, you get to discover its meaning as you go through the book.
And even just the fact that Jesus taught in parables, and he often replied to questions with questions. And I felt like there was something about having it's like if you have the heart of a seeker, like you actually want to know what's true, then you're going to use the question as an invitation to go deeper. Versus if your intent is to just be a skeptic and to just knock something down, well, then you're not going to use the question, to go deeper. But you would have used an answer, a straight up answer, as a weapon back at them, saying, "Hey, well, that can't be true because of blah blah blah." Like so I think that the tool of the question is a very powerful, a very powerful tool.
For sure. Yeah.
So in the book, y'all use Moses and Adam as sort of representatives of what you call the noble and then the hopeful. So Moses as the noble representative and Adam as the hopeful representative, which I thought was just so charming. I really enjoyed it. Will you tell the folks sort of what each group represents? So you have the noble and the hopeful, and why you decided on those specific figures for those representations.
So when you think of Moses, what comes to mind is the Exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt. And you think of the tablets, the 10 Commandments, the law. So you think of Moses as someone who really cares about the law and what is written and the accuracy of the revelation. And you think of that as the value system. And so we were choosing Moses as a sort of archetype of perhaps even Christians who would care very much about, we're not doing reader interpreted. We're not doing we're not being too progressive over here. We're not just trying to use philosophy to just, philosophize things away. Like
we're not going to appeal to our dreams or to other sources. We're going to look at the revealed words.
That we would very much value the arguments, what has been written. We value the word of God. We value, and that is actually noble. And so because of that, we wanted to give the title or the meaning of that, where perhaps somebody who's on the other side and they think, oh, if you believe in something like an eternal hell, that would be evil, that would be horrible, right? And it's almost like giving people on the other side another frame for thinking about people who might defend such a view as eternal punishment. And it's actually out of some virtue. It's out of the nobility of wanting to take the revealed words of God throughout history seriously. And so that was why we chose Moses for that side of the argument.
Yeah, and we never take that away. It's not like we set up a good character only to reveal that in greater light, it's not a good character. All the way through the end, you find yourself rooting for all the characters. Because that's one of the things. It's can you have a disagreement even in heaven where all the characters are good and virtuous? That's already sort of a philosophical question, because you might assume, no, if you're good, then you have a uniformity of beliefs. You can't have different perspectives. But I actually think that some of the deepest and most meaningful opportunities for love and for the experience of love comes precisely through difference of perspective. That's something we wanted to showcase. So the other side was the hopeful, and they represent, so there's this question, how would you feel if we let a dark one or a separated one, they didn't know in the beginning how dark this separated one was or who this was, but how would you feel if we gave them opportunity to be with us? And so the hopeful represented a case for hope, for the possibility that this was a good thing. Which, if I can just add here, this was out of the interpretation of the question as this is a test. The Lord wants to see what we think is appropriate. But then later through experiences, there's an interpretation of the question as, well, how would you feel? Emphasis on the word feeling. And so it gives a little bit of a different, is this a test to figure out what's true? Or is this a test to figure out how we would feel about such an offer? You see, and that's different. And I think sometimes I can say for myself, sometimes as a philosopher, I'm caring so much about truth. It's almost like I lose sight of some of the heart things, things that may actually matter so much, but then gets lost when we're just debating to figure out, okay, is this true or is this true? Well, how would you feel if this were true, even if it isn't, for example? How would you feel? Would you be upset? Would you be like, oh no, that violates, you know what I mean? So
yeah, for
yeah.
sure. That's really, really, and it really is cool how you like Moses is, like you said, like noble till the end or whatever. You know, it's not some flaw. You don't find out like there's just some flaw in his character is why he was thinking this.
Or even
way.
in his reasoning.
Yeah.
Even in his reasoning,
his reasoning was tight. Yeah, right. Yeah, I real quick before we move on, okay. I really, so Josh, you brought up that there was sort of a shift in understanding what the question was to begin with, sort of in the middle of the book, which I picked up on right away, and I thought that was really wonderful kind of move within the narrative that you were depicting. So
that's cool that you picked up on it, because it wasn't explicit.
That's great. Yeah, it was very subtle. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Well, and it's relevant to how we understand other revelation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are things in the Bible. I wonder if God, in His wisdom, sort of sees how these things can be interpreted in this way, given this context, given this state of limitation, this state of lack of knowledge, but knowing that in the fullness of time there'll be new interpretations, clearer interpretations. But it's almost like you need a certain set of experiences even to appreciate those interpretations. Like when you go back to the same text again and then you get something new out of it that was there all along, but you never noticed it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that really hit home with me, that whole like experience unlocks meaning. And like, I mean, it's just like people want to say like, oh, it obviously says this or whatever, or obviously like the plain reading or whatever. But like, I mean, in reality, like your experiences throughout your life are everything when you look at it. Like there's no just like, it's not a math problem or whatever when you read a book, for sure. And
like the dress obviously looks gold. No, it looks blue. Like we looked at that dress picture, we saw opposite colors. Okay. Opposite. Yep. You know, so it was obvious that it was whatever it was. Mm-hmm. Exactly. She actually pulled it up on the computer and zoomed in on the pixels, and that's how I was able to shift.
Oh my gosh. The next one we have is, so in Moses's opening statement, so kind of like the way it's laid out is they get presented the question and they each side gets a chance to do like an opening statement. And in Moses' opening statement, he uses the 4 pillars of wisdom, you call it, and it like were justice, revelation, liberty, and agreements. And I thought that was really interesting, like the way he like, or not necessarily, like it wasn't really something Moses came up with, the character. It was just kind of like the way it was. But it was interesting, like the 4 ways you kind of broke down his like argument and his understanding. I'm just curious, like how you came up with that. Like how did you decide to use the pillar imagery and like the scrolls and whatnot coming out of them, and like how'd you kind of come up with those 4 concepts as a way to, break it apart?
So there's the conceptual and then the presentation. And when we sort of divided our tasks, we both entered into both projects. Rachel was the director of the presentation and the event sequence, or let's say had the final say on that. And then I took myself as kind of a director of the conceptual drama, or the idea drama. So there's an event drama overlaying an idea drama. And when I was thinking about kind of how to divide the main arguments, the ones that I've personally, let's say, wrestled with or thought a lot about or heard a lot about, ones that persuaded me, and that I then saw under new light through further reflection, it seemed like they kind of boiled down to those 4 categories. Well, actually, the first one, the argument from contracts or agreements, that was kind of off the wall. Like that's a new one that's for the plot. And that opens your mind to things that are maybe on the edges of what Christians might normally think about, talk about, but not irrelevant to the plot. So the idea that there's a whole set of arguments just from the Bible, and how do we interpret the Bible? And then I've noticed in conversations and also in my own reflection that once you sort of work through enough of the biblical data, there's always these philosophical arguments that come up. One of them is from liberty. Actually, I was having a conversation with J.P. Moreland. I think were you with me? But I was having a conversation with him about this, and he brought up the argument from liberty that, God honors people's choice, so people can choose to reject him. And if they do, then they're separated, and God will honor that choice. And then the argument from justice, that you can't just give separated souls who choose to be separated a free pass that violates the laws of justice. And it seemed like those are kind of the general categories of arguments. And by setting it up in terms of the scrolls or the pillars, it allowed for an exploration of those arguments in a kind of depth through the debate that place.
Yeah, for sure. That's really cool. Yeah, I guess we're gonna get into that we kind of have laid out. But I thought, like, for sure, like whenever you have these conversations, for sure, justice and free will or liberty are like the two things that people definitely bring up. So I thought the way you engaged with these ideas was really cool, and really, like, some of the analogies you use, like, really hit home, and like I thought were really good, especially about like the free will, how, like, I think there's a lot, like, that's a big one for me, because I think people just, there's so many understandings of free will. It's such like a philosophical topic and whatnot, but like, what does it really mean to be free? And like, you kind of explore, like, is it really a freedom to have, like, if you don't fully understand, and is really like making this horrible choice really free, or is that just like not free, you know? And I think you explored that in a really cool way, for sure.
Yeah, and then even when a choice is free, love always protects. That's a verse we bring in there, you know. And it's like, well, what choice? When I think of my kids, like, which choices would I give them, and also, would I ever sort of give up? You know, do I have the power to give them a new choice, for example? I mean, it's kind of interesting for each of the arguments that are for the noble or against the hopeful, all the arguments against allowing somebody to come in, there is a way of flipping all those arguments around so that we end up making the argument an argument from justice as a way of making things right, against the idea that beings are separated in a way that doesn't make right broken relationships. And then from liberty, we end up making an argument right from liberty for the possibility of getting new chances, you know, because it's all about a possibility, right? How would you feel if, you know, if there was an offer, if there was a possibility? And so that's something we explore.
Yeah.
I can pick up on that real quick.
Yeah.
The insights from Adam's character in the book, having to do with justice, I think intersects really beautifully with sort of contemporary discussions of justice in theology and biblical studies, and even sort of political philosophy and the like. A lot of Christians living in the modern Western world, I think, have a very sort of limited understanding of justice, usually in terms of retribution, right? Where punishment is the sort of end in itself, in response to some sort of wrong that's been inflicted on someone else. But this, as I'm sure you know, creates even more deficit, right? It's not actually filling the deficit that is created when a harm is done, right? It just keeps sort of digging more and more holes into that already deficient space. So it doesn't actually repair damage, right? It doesn't give back something that's lost in that scenario. And I think for a lot of people, God's justice is like that. God fundamentally does this sort of retributive thing in response to our wrongdoing. This is where we tend to go. And I think it has a lot to do with sort of cultural pressures coming from, especially in political pressures coming from our criminal justice system too. This is really where we go in terms of our concepts, right? But you have Adam saying, hey, wait a minute, justice doesn't mean one thing, right? And the sort of driving account of God's justice is really restoration for Adam in this book, right? In that sort of approach. Even though there's going to be real accountability and real consequences from wrongdoing, right? There is, justice really is to do with restoration, right? Is this sort of, were you having some of this stuff in mind as you were writing this, the sort of larger discussion about justice sort of within biblical studies and philosophy and theology as you were writing this character?
Yeah, certainly. So I had actually done a word study through the biblical text of the word justice. And what I had discovered was that in almost all the cases, like in a very high percentage of the cases, justice was used in context of retribution for the one who was hurt. So it wasn't actually retribution like to basically dig more holes, like to just like
Right.
punish the ones who had done the wrong. It was for restoring those who had been stolen from or who had been abused, or like it was for actually repairing what was damaged. And because that was such the high percentage of cases were used in that way, it would seem like to only think of justice as retributive in the way that you're using it. I just felt like that was not the holistic view of justice. And I do feel like there are contexts where people would say that if you only just give back the damages, you just repair the damages, but you don't also punish those who did the wrong, then that's not balanced, right? So I do believe that from my word study that also was true. But I think that Adam's question that he brings up, do souls serve justice or does justice serve souls? That question really is key, because you can have the same sorts of behaviors, the same sorts of actions with different intentions.
End goals.
Yeah. Right.
I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Yeah, no, I mean.
Well, I mean, just to add to that. Yeah. So, I mean, even if you have all the different views of justice on the table and we don't create a competition between them. So we have retributive justice. We have restorative justice. We have them both. We don't say one is really justice and the other isn't. You can still ask, what's the end goal? Is the goal of retributive justice? Now, I mean, I guess maybe you could build into the meaning of retributive justice that the end goal is serving the demands of justice for no other reason than to serve these demands that must, of metaphysical necessity and of God's nature, be served. But it's so interesting. It's like, okay, I just have to be honest about my own experience with that. So as a father, I remember when I first had the acquaintance with this question about the purpose of justice. It's like I was with my child, Micah, my oldest child, and he was doing something and I asked him not to do it. And then he was just continuing to do it. And it wasn't in his own best interest to continue doing it. So then I said that, well, if you keep doing it, then this is going to be the consequence. Okay. Then he continued to do it. And so then I said, okay, well, now this is going to have to be the consequence. And then after that, he was very sorry. He didn't want that consequence. Now, in that moment, I felt like I still wanted him to understand like the seriousness of what he had done, but I also wanted to honor the fact that he was sorry. And so this may sound kind of weird, but like I gave myself the consequence. It was like a timeout consequence, and I showed him what I was doing, so he could really appreciate the seriousness of that. Okay, now I'm not saying like that's always like the best thing to do or anything like this, but it was in that moment like I was really thinking about this. I was like thinking, would I punish him just to serve the demands of justice, or would I instead have a consequence to protect him from doing something, or as a way of helping him to understand the seriousness of doing something that's destructive to himself? In other words, would the justice serve him or would it not serve him? And I think that's a really fundamental question that is very much relevant. It's relevant to the wider political conversations and how we think of justice and what we think of as its ultimate purpose. And so, I mean, I will just say that I've become persuaded that there is an understanding of justice that has a greater purpose than just meeting the demands of justice that are abstract.
And can I just add that I think that a lot of would think of someone who would be universalist as just considering God's love as overreaching virtue that God has, without taking into account any justice. Oh well, just throwing out God's justice, the whole side of God. It's almost like the picture is that the justice like evens out love. It's like on two sides of a scale. And the picture that Josh and I were trying to give in the book was actually a different picture. Instead of it being love and justice being on opposite sides of a scale, sort of evening each other out, it was actually that the foundation of all the pillars is love. Yes, and then from that foundation emerges something called justice. Now, you might ask, how could justice grow out of a foundation of love? How could it be on the foundation of love? And you have to ask yourself the question, if you only, give your children, good gifts, like all the time, and then let's just say that they start to make very bad decisions. If you never give a consequence, if they never have the mirror to see what it is that they're doing that's destructive, if it's always sort of swallowed up in more and more, you put more and more pads around them so they, don't get hurt. You take more and more wounds upon yourself, like to make sure that they never get wounded. If you just keep doing that, is that actually loving? Because what you're allowing is your child to go on a path where they are actually developing the sort of character and the sort of disposition that is actually self-destructive. And so if you actually are loving, you want to provide some sort of a natural feedback so that they can naturally be redirected back toward the path of, you might want to call it holiness, or of godliness, of righteousness. And I think that if you just look at how the universe is set up, I think that that might explain why we have things like universal laws. We have things that it's like, you cannot break the laws of physics. Like when you're on the earth, like if you trip and you fall down and then you scrape your knee, like that is just a natural consequence. And so then it actually causes you to mediate your behavior. And so, if you could just be as reckless as you want, and then someone was always absorbing the consequences, like if God was always interfering and doing miracles to like take away the consequences, then you might say that actually what that's doing is God's actually enabling bad behavior, which is actually inconsistent with God's holiness. So we really tried to draw out that distinction.
Yeah, and the way that the love motivates that. And it's interesting because then what you have is this pillar of justice that comes from love. But then this pillar of justice ends up providing one of the strongest arguments for restoration, even of separated souls, or at least of the possibility of that. Because again, the justice is about making things right. And as long as there are broken relationships, we draw out the implications of this. What's it like as a parent to be separated from your child? Like, do you just feel happy about it? Well, is God happy in heaven? Or does God just forget that they're being separated from him? You know what I mean? It's like, how can God's happiness be complete while they are being separated from him? And if it's not, then not everything's made right, even in heaven.
Yeah. Yes.
Not only in hell, but also in heaven, right?
That's right.
And if things aren't made right, and if justice is making things right, well, then it sounds to me like in order to actually meet the demands of justice, those relationships would need to be restored. So that really, I would say that on this frame, the best argument for eternal separation would have to be an argument that justice isn't fulfilled. Things aren't made right. And that kind of turns it on its head, right? Because a lot of people would say, no, the eternal separation is supported by an argument from justice. But, right, the argument I'm just giving turns that exactly in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it goes the opposite way, right? Yeah. And I do wonder at that point if God sort of fails in that other scenario, if justice isn't actually fulfilled ultimately, and it just sort of stops. Are we suggesting that God's sort of ultimate purposes end up in some kind of failure?
Maybe he fails, but maybe it's sort of metaphysically necessary, right? So
sure,
even he can't help it. It's just the demands of justice.
So he's upholding those demands, right? Yeah, right.
Yeah, but still, I mean, it's very interesting to turn the argument from justice around, so that it's no longer the argument that, well, if justice is fulfilled, then hell has to be forever because these are sins against an infinite being. And it's like, no, it's the opposite. If justice, if things are actually made right, if that is possible and God doesn't fail, then there has to be reconciliation ultimately.
Yeah, for sure. And so, like, just to add to that, like, I've thought about that too, and that's what kind of led me toward like an annihilationism view. But then you even explore that, like, is it really justice and love for God just to eventually just give up on somebody? and that just doesn't seem right either at all. Like the picture of like love is always there. If there's always love, then there's always a chance, and so it's interesting. You kind of like hit it from the two sides or whatever. So like like if there's always a chance, but yet it's never fulfilled, then justice is never served. But if he does put an end to it, then he kind of just gives up and like it isn't all loving or whatever. So I thought that was really kind of like a really, really good case, basically. At least
it's also interesting. I mean, if you've ever had an experience of having an enemy who becomes a friend, there's something, I've had that experience, and there's something so meaningful and so rich. It reminds me of Jesus's statement, who forgives more, the one forgiven little or the one who loves more? Who loves more? Or is it who loves more, the one forgiven little or the one forgiven less, right?
Yeah.
I can't even.
He's the pastor's kid, by the way.
Thank you. This is why she's here.
Oh, let's do a theology check for you.
Oh, you guys know what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
No, I know. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. So that richness of reconciliation, because you might wonder, well, why even create beings that why take a risk of separation even in the first place? It's like, well, there is value in choice, but then there's also value in the reconciliation. And sometimes it's not that, it's not like this. It's not like you want somebody to be separated for the sake of a richer experience of reconciliation. It's just that when you consider the risk of that, you also consider the ultimate value of reconciliation in the long term, if that is a possibility.
Yeah,
for sure. I'm trying to see where we're at here. I know. Yeah, we had like a whole list of questions. I'm all confused now.
Yeah, I mean,
we
can kind of transition into sort of.
Are you guys going to raise some objections, some penetrating critiques?
Yeah, I mean,
it's going to hurt.
Yeah, no, I mean, both of us are.
The problem with having me on is that I'm a universalist, so I'm not really gonna push back too much.
Yeah, and John's kind of the one that's gotten me down this path of really, really exploring these ideas a lot. So.
So Ethan, are you still a nivelationist, or have you become more hopeful?
I'm pretty sure I consider myself a universalist at this point. Like it just as far as I don't know. I'm pretty much like haven't been convinced by any other argument. So, but I don't like to take too strong of a stance because I know it takes a long time. I'm never gonna know everything. So, I mean, obviously, I don't think any of us are taking like we know this to be true or whatever. But
so I think one thing that is interesting to point out is that what our book does is it tries to actually expand the picture a little bit beyond the traditional Christian narrative of God created the world, and then it's the world is sort of like the holding bay for making a decision. And then once you make a decision, then there's the rest of eternity. So it's basically, it's like there's 3 stages. It's like God creates, then we make the decision, then God keeps, or he throws them out, right? And I think that what I would hear from a lot of Christians or from my own upbringing, my own feeling would be that, well, the biblical text, basically tells the story of the history of the universe and the cosmos and the future of everything, right? So having that understanding, then it's like, okay, well, there wasn't anything before humans were created on the earth, and then there isn't any other drama or any other plot besides the new heaven and new earth that just starts this new era, and it's sort of just stagnant. Like there is no other like epoch of history after that. It's like you start the new heaven, new earth, and then that's kind of it. It's almost like a you just have a line graph and you just keep it going, and it just is kind of constant, right? And I think that there's on that view, it wouldn't actually make sense to say that there could be another choice, right? Because it's going against the whole frame. It's like by the frame of understanding, there was one choice that you had, which was in the holding bay of the earth. right? During your lifetime, you had one decision to make, whether you're on the right side or the wrong side. And then after that, it's just stagnant. It's like it just continues going in a certain direction. There's no turning back from that point. And I think that perhaps, when I consider for myself, that would perhaps be one of the hardest things to be considering, like on a universalist frame, because and I think that's also why a lot of universalists would even just make the argument as well that there is no hell. Like there just is no such punishment like that. Because if there's that frame, it's like there's other reasons to make that argument as well. Like God just wouldn't do such a thing. However, I do believe that if you look at the sort of suffering that human beings are allowed to go through on the earth, like you can reason that God would allow human beings to go through all sorts of suffering. So it's not just like off the table for a loving God to allow some amount of suffering. So I think that in the book, creating that fictional setting, throwing in a little bit of these, food for thought, comments every once in a while. I think that the purpose that I would have in that is to open the framework instead of it being so like, bookend, sort of like the interpretation of history is like with two bookends. It's like you have the beginning, you have the middle holding bank, and then you have the end. Right? Instead of thinking of it like that, like think of it as an ongoing story, like that in a sense, maybe on different levels, in different contexts, God continues to strive with his creation, and that the Bible gives us the story, perhaps with glimmers of the outside context, but mostly the biblical story is telling us how God will contend with human beings on the earth during this
episode.
Season. Yeah, during this episode.
Yeah.
And so we're not actually told any backstories about how God was interacting with the angels before he created the earth. We're not really told about that. Like, did that all happen in this sort of, one verse at the beginning? Like, God created everything. He created the heavens and the earth. And so all of that drama that happened wasn't even really real. Like, there wasn't even really a drama. But somehow we have the serpent in the garden. So how did that happen? Like, we weren't told that story, And so then it's like, okay, well, we have a little glimmer of that in later passages, right? But I think that if I can understand the perspective of a lot of Christians who might be resistant to the universalist picture, the way that I would understand their feeling of resistance would be that it just doesn't make sense if you have the bookend view of the reality that we're in. It's like, how can you have another set of choices after the book is over? Right.
Unless you just skip the judgment, right? Because that's one of the things we wanted to do in the book was to show how it's actually possible through judgment for there to be another episode and even reconciliation.
So then that goes into another meta analysis of what the purpose of the scripture is and, how to interpret some of these things. And so like, that's a whole other topic, which, we didn't want to get distracted. So in this sort of fictional content, we can just, throw a few little things in there to just, be like, oh, I never thought of it that way, and we just throw little things in there. But
and again, the goal, I'm sorry to interrupt, but like the goal is not like, oh, we have an agenda. Like this is our secret special way of trying to kind of persuade people through fiction or something, like it is exactly what we said at the beginning. It's like exploration, because exploration widens your options for thinking, understanding.
And I think that that's one thing that, if there were another love language, it would be exploration, like for us, right?
Nice.
It's like we would just like to consider, like, what if, and asking those questions, I think leads to the sight of something. Oh, I actually didn't see that verse could mean that if you have this frame. Like, oh, I never saw that before, right? And then it opens your mind to the ability of things being hidden even within the scripture that you just wouldn't see if you have a certain frame. And so causing there to be a little bit of curiosity about the frame, I think is one of the things that I personally would be very animated by. And so, like, I mean, for me, like, that's even why I would throw in some little things that could be considered controversial, but I do that on purpose because, hey, like, let's just consider, you know, there's a frame that we have. Why do we never question the frame?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't even see the frame sometimes that we have because it doesn't feel like a frame. It just is reality, right? And then
feels natural. Yeah.
Yeah, by seeing another frame, it actually helps you to see that, oh, okay, this was actually a frame. Yeah.
And the fictional setting really helps to do that in a way that's
not threatening.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I totally agree.
It allows it to be something where it's like, oh, okay, that's an interesting idea. Maybe it has no bearing on reality whatsoever. You know, and we're actually not attempting to make an argument about what the reality is in this book. We're actually, the goal that we have is to actually just allow people to have new ideas. It's a new way of exploring the topic so that people can perhaps even see one another better.
Yeah. To see each other, to really enter into the different perspectives, understand each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask one more question, sort of out of respect for time. I know that we need to get to some Q&A too, Ethan, if that's all right. But
there's a few we can.
I want to ask sort of loop back to something that Ethan indicated earlier, which was about kind of personhood and what it means to be a person. But before that, I would like to know, to kind of push you beyond the book, how would you describe your own positions on universal restoration? How would you sort of describe yourself? Not assuming that you completely agree with one another, but would you describe yourself as sort of hopeful universalist, something stronger? I guess how would you describe that?
It's very interesting because I always feel like I'm on a journey, you know, and so I sort of hesitate to come down too strongly on a position. But when I first began the journey, it was started by this article, Universalism in the Bible, by Keith Thoreau's, a Christian philosopher at Yale University. And that article, it didn't persuade me of universalism, but it persuaded me that it was possible for somebody to believe that the biblical data points towards universalism. And that before that, I didn't even know that was possible. And so I just thought, oh, the only people who would think that there could be an ultimate reconciliation are people who don't take the Bible seriously or they don't believe it. And so that was just kind of the beginning. And then there was just kind of a long series of episodes of me kind of looking at a rock at a new angle. I would come to a verse and then I would think, well, let me look at the Greek on this, you know, so I'd investigate that. And then it just, things started to I don't know what to say here. Things started to shift in my mind. And it was very slow. And one night I had a dream. And in my dream, I was talking with somebody about the view that there's the eternal conscious torment view. And in that dream, I told them, I said, I don't believe any being will be eternally tormented consciously. And then when I woke up, I realized that my belief had changed, because up until that point, I did believe that. Now, it wasn't that I believed the opposite. It was that I was at that point agnostic. This shows you how slow and gradual my journey has been. And also, it's one of those things where if there's a view that's labeled as dangerous, don't go there. You might even lose your salvation if you go over there. I mean, this is where the David Bentley Hart's story is so different than mine, because he said he never had the eternal conscious torment.
Exactly
view.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's like,
coming into
I think he was kind of baffled, like, how come people seem to hold on to this view despite all the biblical evidence, all this stuff? It's like, why? Like, do they not even want? You know, why not at least hope for universalism? And I think for me, it's because any other view was called dangerous, and so it was like considered to be compromising the Bible. It's like built into my system, and so it was very, very slow journey. And then I moved from there to, you know, I consider the annihilation view, and began to be a hopeful universalist. And I think it's healthy for me to just be honest and transparent that I'm past the hopeful. So I'm more thinking it's probable that the ultimate reconciliation is probable. And Alvin, by the way, Alvin Plantinga said this to me in the halls at Notre Dame, and I asked him this question. He said it was probable, and that for me was very interesting because I never knew that Alvin, you know, this great Christian philosopher, thought that universalism was a probability. Never knew that before. And just hearing him say that, in a way, was kind of encouraging to me.
So yeah, I do have a little bit of a different take on it. So I was raised in a very like conservative, like fundamental Bible Baptist church, right? So that's kind of my upbringing. And I remember the sort of, the type of sermon where, if Christians really believed in the eternal torment of hell, they would crawl over broken shards of glass in order to rescue those who were perishing. And I feel like it was the sort of thing where I felt very guilty and also very powerless, because it's like, well, if I'm not like trying to save somebody right now, like I am like doing something very horribly, eternally bad, right? But then what am I supposed to do? Is like, there's 8 billion people in the world. Like, I'm just one person. Like, even if I just like try to talk to every single person I can, like that's just a small shred. It like hardly makes a dent on the sort of eternal torment, right? And then you add into there the complexity of, well, what about the people who are making the arguments like, they were, hurt by the hypocrisy in the church, and it's not just so simple, or maybe they have other data that they're considering, maybe, and then you start to get into that mucky debate area, and like, it just makes it so hard, right? And so I think that for me, what I have really learned in my own life is that there's something very important about being in the present moment and having your own power and personal sovereignty to make a decision right now. Because I think that when we are considering, even when everyone's attention is on the, the elections and what's happening in Washington, it's like most of us are not actually there. And that's just a very small number of people somewhere who don't even know us, and we don't know them either. So it gives this illusion that we're stuck in this reality that we actually have no power to change. But then we think we might have a ability to change it if we just vote, but then we realize that one vote against millions really doesn't make a difference, right? And so it's this weird dilemma where we're putting all of our power on everyone else's actions. And I think that as Christians, we can also feel the same way, like, well, all the power is in other people's actions, and whatever God decides, like, so I don't have any, ability to really do anything, to change anything. But the way you flip that all around is you say, no, actually, I have the power right now, whether I will be continually filled with the Spirit. Will I exemplify love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control? Will I choose right now to do the hard thing and, tell my child who is doing something I think I don't really agree with them to do, will I try to correct them, even though it's an inconvenience to me, and I would rather just let them do it, and, I understand that later that will have, a consequence because I didn't keep the boundary the first time, so why would they keep the boundary the next time? Like that, basically, the way that I have started to consider reality is by the frame of the present moment. What is it that I can do in the present moment? And then if I consider it that way, suddenly everything seems more flexible. Because think about God telling Moses, I'm so mad at the Israelites, I'm going to destroy them. Moses replies and says, but wait a second, God, these are your people. What are the Egyptians going to think if you wipe out your people, right? Moses is in the present moment negotiating with God about what God is going to do presently. That's a very vulnerable and real moment. And if we can enter into that reality of the present moment, then suddenly, well, when Paul is, speculating about whether there's a resurrection of the dead, and he's saying, well, if there were no resurrection of the dead, why are all these people getting baptized on behalf of the dead people? And you're like, what? Like that just went over my head. I have no idea what you're talking about, right? But if you consider it that this is a real raw moment in the present, and if you really believe the Christian frame, every person that has passed on is real, and they are presently existing and experiencing something right now. So if you think of it all in the very present moment, you say, what can I do what is God doing? How is he thinking of that? What is that person doing right now? Like, what is reality like? Instead of thinking of it as it's something off there that I can't do anything about that future, think of it as what can I do right now? Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is within you. So you bring the kingdom of heaven wherever you are, moment by moment. And you can choose whether to be bringing the kingdom of heaven or whether not to be, right? And that's a present moment. And that actually, it doesn't actually predict whether someone could actually accidentally, when they're hiking, they, slip down, the trail and a big boulder, pins them down and they can't escape. And, it's a very tragic thing. Like, you can't actually predict that, but you can choose in the present moment. How am I going to align myself? Am I going to align myself with God or am I not? And I think that if you have the frame of that is the most real reality, it kind of shifts everything so that, I don't know, for me, it makes it so that everything is a possibility. It's always a possibility. It's like, if Moses could negotiate with God, like, why couldn't we? Like, and so that might be a controversial frame, but for me, that has been very helpful, even just how I'm living my life, instead of thinking of, oh, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen in the world. Like, what's happening? Is it the end times? Who knows what's happening, right? And instead of thinking it like that, no, I'm thinking about, what am I doing right now? How am I being filled and led by the Spirit right now? And what sort of, world am I creating for my family right now? And why am I waiting for somebody else to do something before I choose to act? So that, for me, has been a frame for understanding this that is a little bit different, I think, even in terms of like thinking, oh, well, I'm just a universalist. This is what I believe is going to happen someday. I think of it in terms of right now, what is sort of the probability space, especially because I'm a scientist and I think quantum mechanics, I used to solve wave equations like that. That's my language, right? I understand that. So I think of it in terms of the probability space. It's like, well, what could be right now?
And how can you contribute to that?
And how can I move toward the thing that I want?
That comes into the book, right? Because the question was given to the citizens of heaven. At first, you think it's a test to figure out whether universalism or reconciliation is possible or something. But then later you find out that, oh, the restoration depended on the choice of the beings in heaven. So like, what if the question of whether universalism is true depends on us in the end, in the long term? Like, what if it actually depends on whether beings seek reconciliation or don't? You know what I mean? Because it's almost like we think, well, it just depends on like whether it's just true in the abstract. But I like how you're putting that, Rachel. Like, if you think in terms of, okay, the present is what's real. What can I do? Can I negotiate with God? What's a possibility here? And maybe part of the game is God's sort of waiting to see what we will do. You know what I mean? Like, he's waiting to see, almost like, what will we try for? What will we press in towards? And maybe there's some pressing ins that in a interesting sort of way inspire God, sort of in the way that our kids inspire us. I mean, within constraints, right? But it's like when our kids want something, there's a way in which they can move our hearts along a direction. So if it's possible, then maybe it could become actual, but maybe it's not ultimately out of our control.
That's super interesting. Jeez.
Ethan, would you mind if I ask the
go
person in question real quick, and then we can move into Q&A?
Yeah.
Thank you guys, by the way, for doing this.
That was awesome.
A great discussion.
This is awesome. This is so much fun.
Thank you so much for your
for
insights and for
one
sure.
One thing I do want to say on what we did just talk about. I knew there was something I wanted to say and I lost it, but if I don't say it right now, I'll lose it again. So I'm saying it. But I thought like what you brought up about like the whole evangelism and stuff, and I was actually kind of having this conversation on Twitter like right before now, and you explore this in the book really well. Is like, and especially what you were talking about, like we have control over like what we do now, like no matter what like the outcome is, like ultimate end, like right now still does matter, and like these things really do still matter, and like the way you portrayed like God actually being grieved by like when Satan was like all that stuff was happening and whatnot, like I thought that was like super powerful, and that's like it like some people want to say like, oh, if the ultimate outcome is everyone will be saved, then why does any of this even matter? And like just if I know, like, it's like the same thing. Like I could think like, yeah, I'm gonna die one day, you know, but like.
Right.
It does.
Who cares how I live right now?
Yeah, exactly. It still does
Well,
matter.
you know,
right
Ethan,
now,
if
really
I see like a
matters.
car is about to hit you,
yeah,
and I think, oh, I'm not going to protect Ethan. You know, I'm going to let him get smashed or whatever, because you know, in the end, he's going to go to heaven. Whatever. And it's like, okay, but I mean, there is a reality of suffering now. You know, and better to enter into flourishing sooner, to relationships sooner. Better to seek the good as soon as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
Ethan, what you brought up segues beautifully into the question about personhood, because where I was going was with God being deeply grieved and suffering every time pain was inflicted on Lucifer in that sort of purifying judgment sequence in the book. And you suggest that part of God and part of all of those who are in heaven, in some sense, would be in hell if souls were destined to sort of reside there forever, right? And therefore, there would be suffering in heaven if that's the case, right? What do you think this implies about how we think about personhood as Christians? Especially when the sort of world around us constantly has us thinking in sort of individualistic ways, right? How would you sort of suggest that we should think otherwise?
Okay, I think we probably both are itching to speak to this. So here's what I've noticed, and it is showing up a lot in political tensions. It's so easy to do this. I'll speak from the first person. I easily reduce a person to their characteristics. I think of them as a character. And if it's a good character, I might admire them. And if it's a negative character, I might be disgusted with them. But, you know, there's a huge difference between the being and the characteristics that the being has. And I'm convinced of this. I'm actually working on a book on the existence and origin of persons right now. And one of the outcome themes of this book is going to be about the value of beings, of a person that's distinct from the value of its attributes. So, you know, when I think about Rachel's love for me, I want her to love me, the one inside. And I would love it if she loved me even while I'm not doing so great. You know, that might even motivate me to do better, right? There's a biblical precedent for this, that while we were still sinners, God loved us so much, he died for us.
That's right.
Right? So, but how can you love somebody who has negative characteristics unless the being with those characteristics is different from their characteristics? Right. The being is always valuable. And for me, I find this so helpful when I think of people across, let's say, the political spectrum, and I can find a way of, in my heart, loving with the emotion of love when I think of the person as being just me over there with different characteristics. And I think that difference between the characteristics and the person is so central to even thinking about justice and thinking about how to treat one another. Because if we reduce people to their characteristics, then we just limit our powers to influence, to love, because then we can only love somebody if their characteristics are lovable. But if we see that they're more than their characteristics, then we can love them as a person.
Yeah,
I
sure.
mean, it's very interesting because of it from different perspectives, right? So Jesus said us to be one in his Father are one. And you can wonder, what does that mean? Does that mean I am no longer an individual? Does it mean that I am sort of like one little tiny speck in the midst of like this one thing over there? And I think that this is hard to, you know, really comprehend or grasp, I think, from our current perspective. But if we imagine that actually there's an element of both, that's true. And it comes back to what I was saying before about feeling disempowered when things over there, those are happening and I have no power to change it, right? So you can have the feeling that you're connected to a group, like, for example, our country right now. Like, well, our country just made a decision of something, right? And you can feel like, well, whether you agree or whether you disagree, like maybe if you feel like you agreed that you contributed to that, But what if you disagreed? Like, well, then maybe you can feel all like, distraught because, oh, like, I don't know. I feel powerless. I can't affect it. Right. And then the other way, like 4 years ago, right? Like, people are like, oh man, I feel so powerless. No, like, I can't be. Right. And I think that there's a way in which we can feel part of a group where we're actually very disempowered because we don't take any responsibility for ultimately like what the group is doing. Is like the group is just doing something and we're just kind of floating along with everything.
You can
right?
add your grain.
And so then there's another way of actually realizing that you are the agent of change and of making decisions, right? So it's up to you how you respond. It's up to you whether you're going to talk kindly to someone or about someone, or whether you're going to speak, in mocking ways or, ridiculing someone, right? Those are your choices that you can personally make. And that actually has nothing to do with what somebody else does.
Mm-hmm.
But then you move to another perspective and you say, you know what? I have the ability to make my own choice. No one can force me to make one choice over another choice, but my choice actually affects somebody else. It has a ripple onto another person.
Yep.
So actually, I have a responsibility to make choices that are actually going to multiply goodness and love and all the virtues of God's kingdom, instead of making choices that are perhaps completely ignorant of what anybody else thinks, or making choices that, serve me and that hurt everybody else. Right. So I think that when you go from, it's like you think that everyone's connected, you can have in a sense, a very low level of consciousness, as in you're just, just going along with whatever everybody else tells you what to do. And you're actually not even thinking for yourself or taking any responsibility for your behavior. Right. But I think that once you connect to yourself and realize, no, I am the one who's responsible for my choices, there's a higher level of unity that goes beyond that, which is that two people who are they're taking responsibility for their own choices can choose to unite in their intentions, and they can, in a sense, iron sharpens iron. They can, wrestle with each other, and they can choose to be unified as individuals who are responsible for their own behaviors and their own actions. And then they can choose together corporately to consider how their actions are affecting others. And so I think that, both of those elements are actually very important in considering, personhood, right? Because it's like you have to understand that you personally take responsibility, but there are others outside of you as well. And that the way that you affect others is through your own agency. It's like you actually, can make choices to spread something from your own perspective, but it's actually up to them. You can't force them to act a certain way or think something or to receive something. It's like, it's up to them. They are their own agent, but that as you are freely giving from your perspective, that is what creates that attractiveness that allows the people to come together in unity as sovereign selves, as personal agents. And so I think that that's really, what to strive for. And that's really why it's really vulnerable. God is saying, what more could I have done? When he's considering the rebellious Israelites, right? What more could I have done? Right? Because he's actually considering those individuals as sovereign agents, and he's trying to allow them an opportunity to be unified. Right? But then if they choose not to be unified, that's up to them. Right? So what more could I have done? Right? And so I think that always maintaining that you yourself are open and you yourself want to be unified with people. As Jesus said, you always bless your enemies, right? That is the stance that leads to unity. And that it's actually, a difficult stance. It's a vulnerable stance. And you have to exercise wisdom. We all are constantly making decisions every day that affect that. Yeah. But that ultimately, that's maybe perhaps even the highest aspiration we can have as limited human beings.
Yeah. For sure. That was really well said.
That's great. I'm gonna have to head out. My wife needs to get on a stream and she needs this microphone, so I'm gonna
Okay.
let her do that.
Yeah. I don't know.
But Josh and Rachel, thank you so much for your time, and I would love to kind of follow up with both of y'all at some point, and whether that's just through email correspondence or something like that. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about the book and about what y'all are doing in your lives. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John.
I'll
Thank
see you
you.
later.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Yeah,
It was a
for
pleasure.
sure.
Yeah, take care.
Okay. Well, yeah. And I don't know if we had too many questions in the chat. I mean, I know there were some, but I think we hit on a lot of things. So, and we're about at time anyway, so that was pretty good. I really, really enjoyed this. Again, yeah, like it's everything John said. It's like the book was awesome, and then getting to talk to you guys was really, really cool. I've loved a lot of your stuff, Josh, from a while ago, and like, yeah, it's just been really cool. And I know a lot of people. I thought one thing I do want to add, and I like. As I've been exploring this whole universalism idea, I always thought this was really interesting. And like, I know, like, I mean, you don't have to be a universalist to be a nice person, or, you know, like, that's not what I'm getting at. But I always found it interesting that, like, everyone
Careful.
everyone that would talk, everyone was always like, oh yeah, I love Josh Rasmussen, you know, he's like, and you always have like come across as like such a good person to talk to. And like really like exploring these ideas and stuff, and then like like when I found out you were a universalist, I'm like, it's just funny, you know, the way that works out. Like, and you know, and like I said, I don't want to, and like I think you make a really good case in the book for like people.
Hey, I was nice even when I wasn't a universalist.
Yeah,
I was still the same. I had the same character.
Yeah. I just found that to be like a funny thing or whatever, you know.
You're very kind.
Yeah, exploring this idea. But like, I just want to say, yeah, thank you guys. I put a link to your book in the description. I definitely recommend everybody check it out. And you got a number of other actual philosophy books and stuff too that are all great. But yeah, I just thank you guys for coming on. Yeah, that's really, I guess I can end it there. If you guys want to close out with saying just any last thing, that'd be perfect. But yeah, I just really appreciate it.
Well, just thank you. Yeah, this is very special. And, you know, if there was any question in the chat that you feel like we didn't cover, we could still do that. But if not, then yeah, this has been really great. I very much appreciate this time.
Yeah, and I think my encouragement to everyone would be to just, you know, every day take it one step at a time and consider, what can I do today? And if you're considering every day making a choice, you can just ask yourself, what is the most positive step forward that I can take? And I think that training yourself to always see what's the most positive thing that I can do, what's the most positive interpretation I can give, what's the most positive thing I can aim for right now, that the more you'll see positive things emerging in your realm of possibilities.
Yeah, awesome, very well said. Yeah, I think we hit on most things. Like a lot of it was
cool.
Like we were getting at like what your actual position was, and we definitely touched on that for a while. So yeah, I appreciate this. And yeah, if everybody that enjoyed the video, if you could hit like and subscribe to the channel. I've hit 300 subscribers not so long ago, so thought that was pretty cool. So I appreciate everybody for watching. Appreciate you two for being on, and with that, we will head out.